we were talking about the molecular structure of the water. So, it's one oxygen and two hydrogens connected.
That took a
together.
minute, Anthony. That took
It
too
took
long
longer
for
than
a
it
doctor.
should
Oh, H2O, baby. Welcome to Wonder. I'm Holly Cooke. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Anthony Reid. This is a show brought to you by Geo Co. We're all about exploring connection between people and planet. Anthony and I felt it was about time to go into a feature of this earth which is very close to our hearts, both as people who love coastlines, who love rivers, who feel connected to the waters of the world, and also as scientists who seek to understand it a little better. So, Anthony, it's awesome to have you here.
Let's talk about water. Thanks, Holly. What's your relationship to water, Holly?
Well, I'm definitely a coastline girly. I grew up on beaches, and I love nothing more than actually doing sunset walks on the beach. I think I find it so grounding. I just feel peaceful, and I love looking down and seeing rippled sand and looking up and seeing the sun setting over what is usually like a great expanse of ocean, and then sort of peering to the sides and seeing cliffs that change on such a micro scale with the forces of the waves and the wind ever so slowly. So definitely growing up, coastlines were it for me. I'd look down, and walking in sand is difficult sometimes. So eventually I'll sit down. And I'll make sure no one's really looking at me, and then I'll pick up all this sand and peer really closely at it, and I'll see like these speckled pinks and speckled yellows and go, and shell fragments, and just ask some hard-hitting questions to myself, like, this is really strange. What am I looking at?
Yeah.
And that's only half the story, because then you look up and you see waves crashing and constantly churning over. And sometimes in winter you've got beautiful big stormy waves crashing, and then in summer you'll have blue glass oceans. And so definitely my sort of first port of call with feeling connected to water was along coastlines. And often traveling, I'll feel that you can start to feel the landscape when you get out on the water. For example, when I was in Canada, in Nova Scotia, in the Maritimes, the Atlantic Ocean feels a lot different to the...
It has a different personality.
Totally. It is absolutely a different personality. You can feel it in the air. So getting out on the water, I think, gives you a window into the land you're looking at. So, but if I was to flip it back onto you, what's your connection?
I was thinking about water, and bring it really close to home, and even closer than going down to the beach or being part of that. But one of the most kind of fundamental experiences, I think, is just, this is going to sound a bit silly, but just drinking a glass of water. Do you know what I mean? Like that actually water is, it's in our environment, like you mentioned, it's the oceans, it's the rivers, it's in the atmosphere, it's in the earth itself, and it keeps us alive. It's like the first thing that people, and I certainly in the morning, that's my first port of call.
Is your water.
Is the glass of water. And I've just been thinking more and more about that, with this topic for us, how water is it's such a vital part of what we are. Not just our personalities, but our physicality is so much to do with water. And I just think that it's an amazing substance, for many, many reasons. And, we kind of take it for granted, and maybe city people take it for granted more than country people. I don't know.
No, I think you're onto something. I love that differential in scale. Immediately, my head went to big landscapes, big earth pictures. But the reality is I'm trying to think of like freshwater versus saltwater.
Yes.
Our drinking water, actually, this is
percentages and numbers.
Yeah.
So the numbers are something like, of all water on Earth, something like 96 or 97% is salt water.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's why we're the blue planet, right?
Yeah.
Because it's almost all
ocean,
right? Most of it is ocean, and then there's then of that percentage which is not ocean, most of that is tied up in the ice sheets, so in the Antarctic or in the Arctic ice sheets and in glaciers and that. And a small percentage of that is of the fresh water available. As I said, is in the ice sheets. A smaller percentage even is in rivers and lakes, and that and then there's certain other percentages which is in groundwaters or this type of thing. But it all gets progressively smaller, and it's amazing how much we rely on water for our agriculture, for our for our culture and our agriculture,
Mhm.
over time and historically. Yeah, and things like the fact that, something like half of all the world's countries experience, water stress,
Mm.
right? So actually, population growth, this sort of stuff, water is so, it's such a scarce resource. We hear that over and over again. And obviously, here in South Australia, the driest state and the driest continent,
Rings bells.
we're all about, water conservation, this sort of stuff. So yeah, water.
Is there particular saltwater versus freshwater
Oh
though?
yeah.
Not to be captain obvious, but one's salty, one's not. Is there anything more to it than that?
In terms of its behavior.
Yeah, so like our oceans are salty, but the our ice caps aren't particularly salty, but
No.
our ice caps are made of ice, and ice manages to float.
Oh,
And this is
I'm
going to hand it over to you.
No, this is one of the amazing things about water. Again, with this physical property of water. When you cool water down, or when you cool anything down, say if you have something which is really hot and you cool it down, it naturally becomes more dense.
Mhm.
So cold things will sink, like in a room, with cold air sinks, and it's the same with water. Colder water will sink. So, and that's an important property for driving oceanic circulations, which you might come back to in a minute. But for the point of this story is that it gets colder and it gets more dense. But incredibly, and unlike lots of other other elements or other physical molecules, as it gets closer to solidifying, so as it gets towards freezing, water actually becomes less dense. It has this unique. There's this sort of one of these unique kind of behaviors or properties of water is that so for example, if you had, like, I'm just being geologists, we think of lava. Okay, so lava is and magma is liquid rock. Okay, so if you cool liquid rock, liquid rock at, I don't know, 700, 800 degrees or something like that, so it's really hot. But when it cools down, it definitely becomes more dense in the same way water does, but then it just becomes...
It doesn't float. It's what it doesn't do.
It doesn't do. But ice, when you've cooled it down, as if it's the lava and it's cooled down and solidified into ice, it actually is so... It's to do with, and I don't fully understand the physics of water, but it's to do with the way that the water molecules arrange themselves, that there's enough space that it becomes less dense than the liquid water itself. And so ice floats.
One of the things that came to mind, as you said, the blue planet, we've had conversations now about times in the Earth's history when it might not have been a blue planet, it might have been a white planet, because a lot of the Earth's water is locked up in glaciers, right? Or
absolutely.
Big continental ice sheets.
Yeah.
So water over millions, billions of years. I mean, it's funny. It's changed the color of the Earth. It's changed the way that the landscape works. And with all these trivial properties, like
seemingly trivial properties.
That's frozen, it floats.
That's right, and it reflects light. Another important thing of those ice sheets in terms of climatic control is the albedo effect. And albedo just means reflectivity, right?
Mm-hmm. No, continue. This is my interested pose. Please go on.
Please continue. So all I was going to say was that ice is so white that it reflects the sun rays. So it actually helps to cool the Earth, keep the Earth cool. So there's a sort of almost a feedback loop there in terms of the world's climate. More ice, less of the sun's rays that kind of heat the surface because they bounce off the ice. And then that helps to cool the Earth further. It promotes the growth of ice sheets and so on. So that part of that whole ice sheet growth that you're talking about from, the times in Earth's history when you had almost complete coverage in ice through to times when you had just ice on the poles, or even times when there's been no ice at all. And part of that process is actually the simply light bouncing off water or ice, albedo.
The reason I got excited is because I was thinking back to a second-year assignment, just in how, like, losing our polar ice sheets is actually sort of devastating for the loss of this effect. Effect is, if you reduce the amount of surface area that a glacier or an ice sheet is covering up, you're not bouncing back as much sunlight. That's the dots that connected there. Was, oh my goodness, these second-year assignments are coming in clutch. Yeah, but even what's also cool about these glaciers is how they also are often the source of some of the world's greatest rivers.
Amazing. Yeah, amazing.
Have you been to one of these rivers with sources in glaciers?
Oh
I think
well,
you
I
have.
have I have been to.
Trick
I
questions.
think a lot of us have
Yeah.
been to rivers. People who've been to places where there are mountains with glaciers will have seen rivers. So I'm thinking New Zealand. A lot of those rivers in the South Island are this incredible braided streams that you see if you're lucky enough to fly into Christchurch. That's all. In some sense, glacier or at least snow melt. I guess the other parts I'm thinking of are the Himalayan rivers,
Mm,
the Mother Ganges, as she's called,
yeah.
who originates up in the high Himalaya there from a particular glacier, and all of those rivers which feed down through the Indian subcontinent. Like the Indus River or the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, things like this. They often start in these highlands, where there are glaciers, and that is a big problem for climate change projections. Where are we going to get this water from? Especially as people rely on those waters, and it's not only current day, you know, civilizations and cultures, but our ancestors.
Yeah, no, for sure. One of my I've got a couple of books that I've been flicking
Hmm.
through. I read them a while ago, and then I've got a bad memory, so we go and read them again. But some of the stories that stuck out with me the most are how ancient cultures developed along some of these really old rivers, and rivers were really a lifeline or helped create life in these spots. Like, so for example, the Tigris, the Euphrates rivers, and ancient Mesopotamia. But then you've also got the Indus Valley civilization, and I think what particularly struck me was this story about the Nile. And you can help me here because I'm a bit loose sometimes on how it actually works. But the bones of the story is that, over time the Nile has a big delta,
Mm.
and sometimes you have parts of the delta which get very steep and they might collapse, like the sandbanks collapse, and it creates big waves. And at the time, it backwashes into the river, it backwashes into the delta where people have settled, or little communities have settled. And even though at the time it's an unwelcome flood, what that flood actually does is deposits a bunch of nutrient rich silts, and over time it builds up pretty vibrant agriculture. And so I went, I'm going to check this out myself. So logged onto Google Earth and went to the Nile and
Oh
saw
yeah. Yep.
the Nile is traced out by on quite a bird's eye view scale.
Mm.
You don't see the water, you see the green patches of agriculture that
Absolutely.
trace the river. It's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah. This overbank deposits. So when the river floods,
Mhm.
as you say, it deposits this huge swathe of clays and silts. I mean, that's what you often when you see a river, you don't necessarily see like a nice crystal clear blue thing,
No.
right? A lot of these rivers are really, really dirty. They
Yeah.
in the sense that they're brown, right? And why are they brown? Because they're carrying a lot of silt.
Yeah.
Which is basically silt of very fine grain, clays or micas, we might say, but those things, those little particles, which and they are coming from higher up in the catchment, maybe ground out of rocks from the glaciers or, washed down from soils and that sort of thing. So when they flood, as you said, in the Nile Valley and the Indus and places like that, they were the best places when our when the human ancestors scattered seeds, they were the good places for the seeds to grow,
Yeah.
So, yeah, river valleys are really important.
And I love that point. Rivers, they carry things. So, yeah, we think rivers and, we're here talking about water, but it's actually the water is carrying sediment. Like
Yes.
it's not crystal, beautiful, perfect water, and it's boring anyway. Who wants that? The interesting rivers are ones that are actually carrying sediments, because the sediments are parts of the landscape that are being carved up further upstream.
Yes, definitely. They're further upstream. They're carved from taken. It's that cycle, right? An amazing thing about that is this interplay. We've talked a bit about this before as well. This interplay between large-scale Earth processes like tectonic processes and climate. And obviously, climate is, to a large extent, about the kind of movement of water in its various forms, whether that is in its solid, liquid, or gas, whether it's in the atmosphere or river or locked up in the ice. And in each one of those forms, the movement and interaction of the water with the mountain, with the mountains, that is what destroys mountains. The water, the glaciers, they destroy mountains. But it's really interesting. There are places in the world where the rate of uplift actually of those mountains it's totally kind of not necessarily controlled, but it's strongly affected by the degree of erosion.
Water erosion can help mountains
Grow.
grow. That is crazy. That is just fantastic. And this is sort of also making sense because as we were driving around in New Zealand, I would, look out the van window and take bad iPhone photos as we're going 100 k's an hour.
Remember this. I must remember this.
Yeah. And I noticed that the rivers were not unclear. What's a better word? They weren't see-through. Transparent. They actually were muddy and they were silty, and it's because they're working. They're working hard. They are working hard.
They're working hard
to dissolve that mountain away. But even it's even fascinating seeing the shapes of rivers. I think it's called like a braided river is what they're called, but it's when there's a sort of big river valley, but there's sort of actually strings of different streams. And I just thought that the geometries of what water can do as it's traveling downstream is really cool
and
too.
This must have something to do with its actual, like we were talking about, the molecular structure of the water. So, one oxygen and 2 hydrogens connected
That took
together.
a minute, Anthony. That took too
It
long
longer
for a
than
doctor.
Oh.
H2O, baby. We've got 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen.
Thank you. 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. The way those things are arranged and their kind of electrical charge and that sort of stuff. Completely forgot what the point of that was because
Yeah, sorry, I made fun of you. Well,
not because you made fun of me. It literally did take me a long time to picture.
And the electrical charge being, while you recover, I like thinking about this. The electrical charge being, so even though H2O, the molecule, is quite a neutral molecule, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have charges within it. You've got hydrogen's kind of charged and oxygen's kind of charged, but the oxygen really, really loves electrons. So what the oxygen will do is kind of suck the electrons away from hydrogen within the molecule.
Like proportionally and in a probability sense, it's the electrons are sort of gravitated or kind of attracted to the oxygen more, right?
Correct. And I think that that's what we call like a dipole moment. But anyway, this isn't a chemistry class. This is just to say that there are many sort of, if you're a bit of a chemistry buff or you like thinking about this, there's lots of these. I'm reluctant to call them small properties of water because it's actually these small properties that define how they behave in our Earth systems.
When you said braided rivers, and we're relating that back to its micro kind of electrical dipole, or it's sort of the uneven distribution of electrical charge in that one tiny little molecule, I immediately think of the way water streams down down your windscreen or on the side of the car. You know what I mean? And it takes this strange, you just think there's nothing there.
That is not the easy path.
That's right. That's right. It does a wiggly thing. And braided rivers are not exactly the same, but there's a relationship there between the way the water kind of behaves and the way it meanders. Yeah, but rivers have their own life cycle in a sense, right? And they start off all bubbly and enthusiastic.
They start out happy. And they get sad and silty.
But they do. They start. So, and that's a classic thing to think about with those high altitude rivers. Tumbling streams full of oxygen. Full of life and kind of exuberance, moving big boulders and not just like little bits of silt, but big boulders and rocks and sands all get flushed down out of the mountains. We were talking about the erosion process. And then they reach that kind of middle age where they're kind of still going. They've got a bit of energy, so they're slightly more meander, slightly more. But the word is anastomose, so they braid in and out.
Anastamo.
Yeah, anastomose.
And even by meander, do you mean like how a snake sort of curls itself?
Like a snake. Yeah, it kind of will move kind of side to side, and you see that. And there's some. And your idea of Google Earth is absolutely fantastic. I've spent many hours, probably too many hours, actually poring over Google Earth and looking at these things. So another absolutely fantastic place to look at these meandering streams is out in just north of the Bay of Bengal. This is where the Brahmaputra comes out from the eastern Himalayas, and the Ganges and other rivers sort of reach it from the west. And it forms this kind of incredible network of anastomosing sort of streams, which flood and reflood and then cut new channels as they make their way down. But eventually a river becomes old.
Yeah.
And the point of this is not about its age. It's actually about its energy, right? And that's all to do with the amount of gravitational difference between up high in the mountains and down the ocean where it ends. So we think about our local river here would be the River Murray. And that's very much a meandering river. So it'll take very long kind of straight stretches, and it might kind of take a little corner here and there. And it kind of meanders. It doesn't make a straight path.
Not at all.
It naturally kind of meanders. And this is an example of a low energy environment. And rivers the world over kind of show this.
And to your point about where rivers meet the ocean. I'm perhaps not sure everyone would know what a delta is. Rather, that's, ooh, am I going to try and explain this?
Yes, you are.
My understanding, if I was just to strip any geology, is where, so we just said that rivers are carrying silt, they're carrying stuff, they're carrying sediment. When rivers meet oceans, it's not a clear cut relationship. It's not entirely clear. The rivers often dump out their sediment into another body of water, which is the ocean. And like we said, rivers don't have the same chemistry as oceans. They've got different energies. It's different systems, and deltas are sort of where this river sediment meets meets ocean.
Empties out. Yeah.
And even another cool thing I read was the weight. This sediment is nothing to laugh at. The weight of the continuous deposition of the sediment can actually bow the earth down. It can sink the earth. There is so much stuff being deposited out of these river systems. It's so heavy, it sinks the earth.
That's incredible way to think that. And big river systems connected to big mountains carry lots of sediment.
Mm-hmm.
Small rivers connected to which have low energy don't usually carry as much sediment. And often those rivers which do carry the sediment, if enough sediment and the oceanic currents are not strong, then the river can kind of what they call prograde. The delta, that sediment which is dropping out at the end, will move its way year by year, decade by decade, year by thousand years, and make the land increase in size.
It grows the land. Rivers grow the land.
Exactly.
Kind of.
Well, and then you would have seen that with the Nile, and the classic, delta. The Nile is one which is getting bigger.
Yeah.
But I think a couple of rivers which don't have deltas.
I was just about to say all this talk about deltas, but it's one of the most spectacular rivers on this planet doesn't, and that's the Amazon River. And so
this is amazing, because you would have thought the Amazon is a huge river, so famous, so much water. It drains. It's like an area kind of the size of something really big.
Yeah, so the Amazon drainage basin. So that is the 1,000 tributaries that feed the Amazon River. It covers an area 3/4, so 75% of continental United States.
Yeah, which is not that far off the size of the Australian continent well, really. Yeah.
And it doesn't have a delta. And it's just to do with it drains to the east into the Atlantic Ocean, and the currents and the tides of the Atlantic are so strong that I suppose it is just sweeping away any of the dumped sediment into the Atlantic Ocean. But even better, apparently the Amazon River didn't always flow from west to east. And that's to your point about mountains. This is because some big old things called the Andes actually popped up about 65 million years ago. And the Amazon before them was flowing from what way? East to west. East to west. And and then you had a big thing. You had big tectonic plates crash together. You had subduction initiated, and we actually grew these Andes mountains. And that would be sort of defying the laws of physics. You can't have a river traveling up West Coast mountains. It has to be traveling down from West Coast mountains into the eastern side of the continent, into the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
And so this is just phenomenal to say that one of the longest rivers in the world actually was forced to change its direction because of big earth forces building mountains. Awesome.
Amazing stuff. And it can also go the other way. So Central Australia has a really great example, okay? So Central Australia, and that's all to do with the rate of change. So things which change slowly, or versus things which change quickly. So, the uplift of the Andes has happened relatively quickly, and it's enabled that, and the river hasn't been able to keep up with that. And so it kind of tilted the other way, and the water started running downhill. It's as simple as that. And continents the world over, they tilt, they shift, they buckle related to these tectonic movements. Now, in Central Australia, we've got, when you go up there, they'll often talk about the Finke River as being the oldest river in the world. And I've got to say, I've always gone, that's got to be rubbish. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know why. I just thought, you often see tourist signs and that, and you think, oh, come on,
guys.
Come on.
Yeah.
So this is the oldest rock in the world. And it's like, clearly it's not the oldest rock in the world.
Let them have their tourist sound.
I know. Anyway, so is the Finke River the oldest river in the world? I don't know, but it's definitely old.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a way that you can tell that, and that's this concept of antecedent drainage, if you want to use. That's your 50-cent word to take home tonight.
Antecedent drainage.
Yeah, so it means that the river was actually flowing in a direction, and the mountains, so we're talking Central Australian mountains, were uplifted, but the river was able to keep pace with that uplift. So it actually carved its way through as the hills and mountains were rising. The river was able to keep pace with that, and so it's cut gorges
Wow.
through those ranges, which means that drainage must have been there before the ranges came up. And it's only occurred to me just recently when I visited Alice Springs, and you can stand on this thing called Anzac Hill. I'm not sure what the traditional names are, I'm sorry to say, but you can stand on this thing called Anzac Hill, and you can look out towards the gap, the gap which is where the train line comes through, which is where the roads come through from the south into the township of Alice Springs. Anyway, and then it suddenly dawned on me, this river is flowing from north to south. It's flowing through that gap. How could this river have carved it? Like if that range was there first, the river should be flowing from south to north, right?
Yeah, like the Amazon. Yeah, like the Amazon.
Like the Amazon. Yeah,
flowing from mountains away.
Away, exactly. But this flows straight through the guts of those hills, right?
So almost looking at frozen time.
Yeah.
Did you get a sense of time? Yeah.
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely. I mean, so the question then is, well, when were those hills uplifted, and when, for it to be able to kind of and slowly carve its way through. So people have done studies on Central Australia and said, those hills, they uplifted in a time period about 350 to 450 million years ago. We know there were big tectonic movements about that time. And so I guess that's where the idea that this river must have predated that big earth movement. I don't really know.
It's a pretty old river.
It's pretty old river.
Come on.
I haven't done the studies, but it's definitely older than those hills.
Yeah.
So it's a very difficult thing to exactly say how old that hill is. But,
very cool. And that's just by asking a couple of questions about why isn't it flowing away from the tall places, from the hills.
How can that river be flowing directly into those hills? And that's because the river was there before the hills were uplifted.
Cool. And just to even, as we begin to wrap up, something that you mentioned to me the other day, it hasn't left me, and that's when I was remarking out loud about the recent River Murray flooding. Oh, yeah. And I sort of asked, where did, all that rainwater that caused these terrible floods in New South Wales, it sort of flew, it ran through sort of southeastern Australia and came out the Coorong, and there are some beautiful satellite photos of those floodwaters meeting the Coorong. But essentially, then you said something about the Coral Sea.
Oh, yes.
in northern Australia. And just to wrap up this sort of thinking about Earth systems, could you explain that again to me?
So, well, we were talking about, that dynamic scale, the scale at which these processes operate. Like when we drink a cup of tea or have our glass of water in the morning in the city, it's somehow we just turn the tap, it's magic, the water is there. Most people, I promise you, probably not even contemplating this, but every drop of water has come from somewhere. Water is not created or destroyed on the earth. It's almost like conservation of energy, right? It is a fixture of this of the earth. So where does that water come from? So it's come from upstream. Okay, you can trace it upstream, as you talked about. It's come from the hills and the tributaries of the eastern highlands of Australia. And where did it come from? There, it follows rain, right? And so where did the rain? It's like one of those never-ending questions, right? And that's the point. It's a cycle, okay? But where did it come from? It came from huge ocean currents, which brought warm water south from places like the Coral Sea, right? And the big circulation systems in the ocean, which move around the globe, right, under the influence of density currents and kind of just the natural effect of the Earth is spinning. Anyway, it's evaporated from places like the Coral Sea and the Pacific Ocean, and then it's brought in, huge systems of weather and dumped on top of the, Australian Alps in the eastern highlands, and then it flows up and ends up filling up the Coorong and flooding out onto the ocean, and producing this sort of plumes of mucky, mucky water, which we saw so clearly down here, and then it kind of it sort of becomes one with the ocean, if you like. Back for where we started.
Amazing. So it just makes you think. Next time you're on a coastline and I'm having a sip of water, it's just exceptional to know that it exists in one big, magic, complex, old system. and the combative forces of tectonics and water. They're constantly carving landscape. But what you just said about deltas building land, they're carving it and they're building it to form this just exceptional symbiosis of nature that we can drink or swim in the summer. How cool.
Amazing stuff. Thanks, Holly.
Thanks, Anthony.